What's up folks, how's it going? This is Watch for MW Technology. Hope you guys are all doing well, and today we're doing a head-to-head comparison between the PlayStation 5 Pro and the standard PlayStation 5. We have the slim version over here. Now this thing starts at $700. It doesn't come with a disc drive or a stand, bringing the cost with those accessories to about $800 versus the standard PlayStation 5 Slim that's widely available is $500. And if you want to get an old used PlayStation 5, the original fat one, you can probably pick one up for under $400, if not cheaper. So that means that this is about twice the price of what most PlayStation 5s are going for. Is it really worth that money? Well, here we're going to take a look at a side-by-side gameplay comparison between these two machines. We're going to take a look at the core specification differences and ultimately determine if the minor upgrades of the Pro is really worth the price tag. Now firstly, I just want to go over through the core specification differences between these two. Now in terms of size, you can see that the PS5 Slim is not that much smaller than the Pro. The Pro is a little bit longer or taller depending on how you want to look at it, at 38.8 centimeters versus 35.8 centimeters on the Slim, but they're both around the same thickness and width and weigh about the same at 3.1 kilograms. Inside, both are using the 5-year-old Zen 2 architecture, which has an octa-core CPU. Now granted, on the Pro variant, it can actually boost up to 10% faster. This may result in better performance for CPU-intensive games, but most of my testing at Cyberpunk 2077 resulted in pretty much the same experience as the standard PlayStation. Of course, the RDNA AMD GPU has been upgraded with the ability to do up to 16.7 teraflops on its float point precision, versus the standard PS5 ran at 10.28 teraflops. This may be a result of increasing the compute and TMU units, but I'm not exactly sure of where we're getting the extra performance for on the GPU side. Both have the same memory bandwidth and memory capacity of 16 gigabytes of GDDR6, but we do have more long-term storage with the Pro variant with 2 terabytes of SSD built into the system versus about 825 gigabytes on the original PlayStation 5, and both have M.2 user expandable storage. Beyond that, there's no version of the Pro that actually includes the optical drive. That's always an extra option. That's about $100 to $80 if you can find one, versus on the Slim, there's an option to actually get the optical drive version for under the $500 mark. Now, the original promise of the PlayStation 5 Pro is that you would get the 4K Fidelity mode of the standard PlayStation 5, but at a higher frame rate, up to 60 frames per second. Is that really the case? Well, not really, but kind of. If we take a look at Spiderman 2, you can see that in performance mode, the motion is very smooth, very consistent at 60 frames per second on the Pro. It's also quite good on the standard PlayStation 5. But is the image actually sharper on the Pro? Well, recording at 4K 60 frames per second in HDR mode using our Elgato Game Capture 4KX, you can see that in performance mode, the standard PlayStation 5 Pro looks quite similar, but upon closer examination, you can see that there's over-sharpening effects and high contrast areas that are simply not the case on the Pro variant, which looks a little bit more realistic, smoother in terms of transition points, as well as more details preserved without those harsh over-sharpening effects and less aliasing. So if you take a look at the trees, for example, you're going to see that on the standard PlayStation 5, they look pretty crisp and sharp, but they're kind of over sharpened and distorted to some extent. If you take a look at the Pro variant, you're going to see that those details within those smaller branches and leaves are better preserved, and those fine textures are still intact versus they're kind of pixelated and blown out of proportion / over sharpened on the standard PlayStation 5 in performance mode. On top of that, things in the shadow are better preserved, both in terms of cast and occlusion data, so the Pro simulates light a little bit more realistically. On top of that, in terms of reflections themselves, in the performance mode, you can see that the transition points between edges in reflection are a lot smoother and less jaggedy compared to the PlayStation 5, which looks quite pixelated in the edges of Spiderman over here. And you can also see that the reflections are softer and less defined and less crisp on the PlayStation 5 Pro, but more realistic nonetheless. Switching into Fidelity mode, which is still 30 frames per second in Fidelity Pro mode on the PS5 Pro, You can actually see that the standard PS5 actually, again, shows you more surface level data with the over sharpening effects that it likes to do with greater levels of micro contrast, but the PlayStation 4 Pro is actually rendering the same effective resolution, and upon closer examination you're going to see that there's more details preserved in the fine textures, even though those edges are not clearly defined with the over sharpening filter effect that is applied to the standard PlayStation 5. Now in terms of improvements in the character models and main assets, you're not going to really find a major difference between the two. Yes, you're going to see softer overall image profile on the Pro, which is going for a more realistic interpretation, but I think many people will actually prefer the look of the over crisp or over sharpened image that we're getting out of the standard PlayStation. Now next, let's take a look at Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. We're going to be using the Performance Ray Tracing mode on the standard PlayStation 5 and the Performance Pro mode on the Pro PS5. So both run really great at 60 frames per second. I don't think that the standard PlayStation 5 struggles playing this game, but I think the Pro version in the Performance Pro mode does offer better overall image quality. Now, not at first. If you take a look, you'll see surface level sharpness is a little bit sharper defined, but once you start taking a look at fine textures, you are going to notice small differences. For example, you're going to see individual tree branches in the distant trees in the background. You're also going to notice that the grass looks a lot more natural and less over sharpened, smoother, with less overall aliasing and jagged effects. Furthermore, you are going to see a greater level of particle effects that are more consistent in terms of their render output. So if you take a look at the confetti over here, you are going to notice that there's more confetti that's consistently rendered, with less being randomly disappearing and reappearing again. Ray tracing in performance mode also is quite different. If you take a look at this reflection on the ground, you're going to notice that the reflection on the ray traced performance mode on the standard PlayStation 5 is a little bit rough around the edges. It's quite harsh in terms of those reflections, quite bright in terms of contrast, versus on the PlayStation 5 Pro, you're going to notice that it's smoother in terms of its transition points. The reflection is not quite as distorted or high in contrast, but more realistic in terms of its light simulating capabilities. And the same thing goes for once you switch on Fidelity mode. You are going to notice that edges of reflection are quite harsh and sharp, and they're not really simulating the texture on the ground, which is, I think, pretty smooth. But you could just see that the quality of the reflection is more realistic in terms of interpretation, might not be as sharp as the standard PlayStation 5 in Fidelity mode, and that's one advantage I think you have with Ratchet & Clank in Fidelity mode. You are going to notice sharper textures and details compared to the Pro, in fact, and this is quite apparent if you take a look at this messaging board over here, where the text and texture features on the board are quite well defined and super crisp. We don't have that same level of perceived resolution, but in fact the resolution is pretty much at the same level, and we have the same basic information being rendered on the Pro variant. It's just not being over sharpened. Moving forward, I did test Alan Wake 2 quite a bit, and I really didn't find a significant difference between the two in terms of fidelity and performance modes. You can argue that it kind of runs sometimes a little bit smoother on the Pro version, but I wouldn't really make that claim. You still have issues with textures popping in and out in this game, and it's kind of poorly optimized for this platform, which is upsetting to see, and the PlayStation Pro doesn't make it really any better. Now, supposedly Last of Us Part 2 Remastered has been enhanced for the Pro variant, but after, again, doing a lot of testing, I really didn't come across any major point where I would say that yes, the Pro version definitely has this specific benefit or that specific benefit. In most side-by-side comparisons, it's going to be splitting hairs in terms of finding any significant difference to mention. However, one thing I do have to mention, and probably the biggest thing about the PlayStation 5 Pro, is the new PlayStation Spectral Super Sampling Upscaler. This is exclusive to the PlayStation 5 Pro, and it's basically DLSS, or Deep Learning Super Sampling, for PlayStation. That means in conjunction with the help of MLAs, you're going to get more perceived resolution, fine texture details, as well as better motion and average frames per second. In older titles such as Final Fantasy VII and Bloodborne that we're going to take a look at, as well as contemporary gaming titles such as Ratchet and Clank, which is using PSSR to enhance its rendering capabilities. Now in Final Fantasy VII, I did encounter a more consistent frame rate that was closer to 60 frames per second. Motion was also nicely enhanced with better and smoother looking animation, in addition to the fact that the texture quality and perceived resolution looked a little bit more polished and just a little bit more contemporary in terms of its rendering output, which definitely looks nice for this super legacy gaming title, which has been remastered of course, but this PSSR enhancements takes it to the next level. Now you can see in this side-by-side example that we are seeing more texture details on certain formations on the ground. Generally speaking, it's not going to be a massive night and day difference, especially when you're taking a look at stills, but in-game you are going to notice a perceived difference between the standard PlayStation 5 playing this game and the PS5 Pro using PSSR. Furthermore, probably the best example of PSSR is with Bloodborne. This is a 10-year-old game, and you can see that with PSSR enabled, you are going to notice a much better overall texture details, sharpness, and resolution, both in terms of shadow and highlights. Specifically, if you take a look at that grass on the ground, as well as the rock formation, in addition to the lantern figurine that we have kind of in the foreground, is a lot more detailed, and you can actually see more pixels, more detail on these character assets, and trees look much more sharper, and there's just less fuzziness and grain in Bloodborne. Now some people may not want this. Some people like the kind of grungy look of the original game. This kind of ruins it for some of those people, but if you do want to experience Bloodborne in a kind of enhanced way, this gives you that option. If you don't, you could always turn the feature off. Now in summary, if you had to rationalize a purchase of a PlayStation 5 Pro, I think there's three key things that you can bring up. Firstly is the frame rate consistency and slight improvements. In certain gaming titles, you can expect to see between 10 to 15% more average FPS. In most cases, you're probably not going to notice a difference, but in some of those circumstances, you are getting better fidelity as well as a higher frame rate on the PlayStation 5 Pro, depending upon what game you're playing. The other big thing is ray tracing. So you do get more realistic ray tracing capabilities, both in reflections and shadow information. It doesn't look as sharp or as clear as the PlayStation 5 in terms of those reflections specifically, but more realistic and more natural, which is ultimately the goal of a ray tracing, to replicate real life as much as possible. But probably the biggest selling factor probably has to do with PSSR, especially if you want to play your legacy games that you've never experienced them before. The PSSR rendering is very tastefully done, adds a nice amount of detail, and the motion consistency and overall frame rate is definitely an edge up compared to the standard FSR or TAA system found on the standard PlayStation 5. The other big thing is, I think this is the future of a lot of these consoles. Because they have limited hardware capabilities, it's going to be up to machine learning systems to kind of enhance the graphical capabilities beyond what the hardware can deliver. And this is a great way to kind of prolong the lifespan of these machines. And keep in mind that this is still running the Zen 2 architecture, which is 5 years old now. And if you were to compare the PlayStation 5 Pro to a modern day $1,000 gaming machine, it would be no contest. This thing is quite far behind in terms of those specification parameters and graphical capabilities. Now beyond that, if you were to ask me if the $200 to $300 extra for the PlayStation 5 Pro is worth it, I would say that 99.8% of gamers out there wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And in fact, a lot of people might prefer the image coming out of the PlayStation 5, especially in fidelity mode, where you do get sharper detail and more crisp textures. That might not be the most realistic interpretation of the game itself, and that's where the PlayStation 5 Pro shines, of being a little bit more natural and realistic looking. But some people just want a sharper, clearer image, and I think the PlayStation 5 delivers that in spades. Ultimately, I don't think it's worth upgrading to the Pro version unless you're a hardcore console gamer that wants the best experience possible with a console, or if you're some sort of PlayStation collector. But really, besides that, guys, I definitely have to know what you guys think. Did you spot a clear difference between the two? Do you think it's worth upgrading if you already have a PS5 to begin with? And if you haven't done so already, please make sure you're liked and subscribe to the channel, and make sure you have post notifications turned on. And I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Without you, none of this would be possible. We'll see you real soon in the next one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you later. Take care.